Thank you all for joining us from various time zones around the world today. My name is Tang Li, Chinese Studies Librarian with USC Libraries, a co-organizer of the conference with Professor Jenny Ling and in the Rusky School of Art and Design at USC. This conference is sponsored by USC Libraries, USC East Asian Studies Center, USC Pacific Asia Museum, USC US-China Institute, and the University of Hong Kong's University Archives. First, we are very honored to have Catherine Quinlan, Dean of the USC Libraries, and Sonia Li, Director of the Asian Studies Center, Associate Professor of Art History, East Asian Languages and Cultures, and Religion, to give us opening remarks. Dean Quinlan, please.
Thank you, Tang, and welcome everyone to the Centennial celebration of the birth and cross-cultural legacies of Eileen Chang. It's an honor and a pleasure to host such a preeminent group of international scholars, even virtually, at our USC libraries. The Eileen Chang papers are among our most distinguished collections at USC, and I'm very grateful to Chung and her colleagues in our East Asian Library, Special Collections, and Digital Library for developing such a vital body of materials that document Chung's life and career. We're proud to be the home of her correspondence, speeches, and manuscripts, and to help advance research about Chung and her impact, which continues to grow on both sides of the Pacific and around the world. Of course, library collections do not and must not exist in isolation. They exist, they thrive across disciplines, beyond geographical boundaries, and in relationship to collections at other institutions like ours, institutions with librarians and library staff who do the important work of organizing and contextualizing archival materials. That's one reason why events like this are so essential, events that showcase the foundational work of libraries in scholarly and creative endeavors. Our libraries are places of academic and creative community, places that embody an ethos of intellectual and cultural connection, and a strong sense of community that has rarely been more urgent than at this time. We're separated by distance and by the realities of a global pandemic. Yet through our libraries and with our partners, we're able to come together today, and this is truly a global gathering. We have attendees from China, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Estonia, the UK, and many other countries. Speakers are joining us from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Duke, and from our own excellent faculty at USC. In the spirit of connection and community, colleagues from the University of Hong Kong also contributed digital materials from their Eileen Chang collections. An outstanding group of creative students has curated an online exhibition based on those and other items, some of which have not previously been exhibited. I'm looking forward to seeing the debut of their exhibition in a bronze mirror, Eileen Chang's Life and Literature, today. In closing, I'd like to thank those students and everyone who so thoughtfully contributed to today's program, including our partners at the USC East Asian Studies Center, the Pacific Asia Museum, the USC China Institute, and the University of Hong Kong's University Archives. I'd like to offer a special thanks and welcome to one of our speakers, Yanwen Gao from Chinese University, who earned her PhD at USC. Welcome back, Yanwen. Thanks again to Tang Li and to Patty Johnson and Howard Smith for helping put together this celebration of Eileen Chang, her life and work, and the importance of library collections to global scholarships and creative arts. Thank you, and we'll have a wonderfully celebratory and productive day.
Thank everybody. I would also like to extend warmest welcome to you all in the audience. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer, Tang Li and Jenny Lynn, for putting together this really wonderful workshop for all of us around the world today. It's really fitting to celebrate the remarkable cross-cultural legacy of Eileen Chang at USC. In fact, there is a long tradition of teaching and research on Eileen Chang and other modern Chinese writers at the university. The person most responsible for making this happen was Professor Dominic Chung. For over 4 decades, Professor Chung taught modern Chinese literature at USC, holding a joint appointment in the departments of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Comparative Literature from 1974 to 2017. Throughout his long career as a leading scholar in his field, Professor Chung has garnered a long list of achievements. 2 in particular stand out. First of all, he's both a scholar and a poet. He has published over 30 books of poetry and prose writings of his own, in addition to another 15 books of literary criticism, anthologies, and translation. His work as a creative writer allowed him to understand many fellow writers in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland China from an insider's perspective, allowing him to cultivate lasting friendships and develop collaborative opportunities both for himself and his students. What I find particularly noteworthy is that Professor Chung considered himself a writer of diaspora, a writer in exile. This perspective enables him to appreciate talented Chinese writers who live outside Asia in obscurity, waiting to be discovered. Eileen Chang is certainly a case in point. Although Professor Chung did not know Eileen Chang personally, he recognized the importance of her work. He arranged for her burial at sea and set up a collection of her work at USC Libraries in 1997. He also met with her publisher in Taiwan to publish the manuscripts. This has led to a major revival interest in her work outside Asia and also in Asia too. Professor Chung's second contribution is his insistence on cultural approach to the study of literature. That is, in order to fully unpack the significance of a particular novel or set of poems, one also needs to develop a more holistic understanding of other contemporary cultural productions, such as works by visual artists, filmmakers, and composers from the same time and place as the authors. In addition to 40-some books I have already mentioned earlier, he's to offer another 10 books on Chinese art. As you can see, he writes ferociously all the time. As an art historian, I can attest to Professor Chung's incredible knowledge and insights as an art connoisseur. But perhaps more to the point of today's event is that the cultural approach to literature or literary works in general works really well with the writings of Eileen Chang, who has inspired a new generation of filmmakers, writers, and artists after her time. Some of our speakers will certainly speak to these lasting legacies today. Professor Chang's legacy now continues under my colleagues, Professor Brian Bernard and Jenny Lynn. Today's workshop will show that they are taking the study of Eileen Chang and other Chinese writers to new heights. And I'm also pleased to say that Professor Chang is here with us today, and he will be offering some commentaries after the virtual exhibition later today. So without further ado, I will turn over to our speakers and let the workshop begin.
Thank you, Dean Quinlan and Professor Lee, for your thoughtful, inspirational opening remarks. So now we'll start our first section of the conference, a panel of 3 presentations by leading scholars on Eileen Chang's various works, followed by a moderated response and Q&A session. The first speaker is Yunwen Gao, assistant professor of the Center for China Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she teaches courses on Chinese literature and research methods. Her research interests include modern Chinese literature and culture, xylophone studies, oral tradition, and dialect literature. She is currently working on her book project titled Language, Soundscape, and Identity Formation in 20th Century China. As Dean Quinlan mentioned earlier, Professor Gao was a PhD student here before, and she was a heavy user of our Eileen Chang collection. And she provided tremendous help to us when we made the collection available online in the USC Digital Library. The second speaker is Jenny Ling, Associate Professor of Critical Studies in the Ruskin School of Art and Design at USC, and co-organizer of the conference. She is author of Above Sea, Contemporary Art, Urban Culture, and the Fashioning of Global Shanghai, and is currently working on another book and forthcoming exhibition entitled Another Beautiful Country, Moving Images by Chinese American Artists. The third speaker is Brian Bernard, Associate Professor of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Comparative Literature at USC. He specializes in Sinophone Studies and Southeast Asian Literature and Film. He is author of Writing the South Seas, Imagining Nanyang in Chinese and Southeast Asian Post-Colonial Literature, and co-editor of Sinophone Studies, A Critical Reader. He is Program Director of the Society of Sinophone Studies and has chaired the Southeast Asian and Southeast Asian Diasporic Literature and Cultural Studies Forum of the Modern Language Association. And the respondent and moderator of the Q&A session is Geraldine Feast, a scholar in residence at the USC's Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, where she teaches East Asian Humanities, Modern Chinese Literature and Film. Her research focuses on Chinese literary and cinematic modernisms, Chinese-German literary and poetic encounters, and Chinese women's literature and film. In her current work, She examines modern and contemporary Chinese poetry and cinema, and the transcultural influences that influence literary and visual modes. So again, a few housekeeping rules to all attendees before we start the presentations. You are all muted and cannot use the chat function, but you are more than welcome to send your questions using the Q&A function throughout the program. Our speakers will address them in the Q&A session when time allows. Now, please join me in welcoming our speakers to the conference.
So, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this event today. And I'm the first one to begin the presentation part. I hope everyone can see my screen clearly in full screen. If there's any difficulty in either hearing my voice or looking at the screen, please feel free to let us know. So first of all, my talk today is titled Approaching Eileen Chang Through Translation. And I would like to first thank Tang Li and Lynn for organizing this event. It is my great pleasure and honor to be in this panel with experts in Eileen Chang and modern Chinese literature and culture. As a former student at USC, I have benefited actually greatly from the USC Library Special Collection titled Eileen Chang Papers 1919 to 1994, and I have been using it for my dissertation project and also my current book project. So when I received the invitation from Tang to talk about how the special collection has helped my research, I went back actually to my Evernote account and found this, just a second, this handwritten note on the upper right corner, as you can see from the screen. And this is a 2016 recording of the content of the special collection during my first visit to the special collection. And of course, back then, the materials inside the 6 library boxes were not completely digitized, nor released to the public. So it was, you have to request them ahead of time and also read them inside the special collection room with gloves on. And I still remember when glancing through the boxes, the box number 5 has a very intriguing essay written in Chinese by Eileen Chang. This essay is titled 1988 2 ? And it opens with a description of Los Angeles County. I hope you can see the handwriting clearly on the screen. So it writes, as I translate here, old Chinese immigrants call Los Angeles Luosheng or Luosang in Cantonese, and Luosang reads like Luoshan in Luoshanji, an alternative transliteration of the county's name, omitting the syllables after Los An. People without prior knowledge would assume this term is the name of a state, for example, Louisiana, abbreviated as LO province or LO state. And the city is indeed huge, though it is as big as a state and known as the Mecca of cars, i.e. a city with the latest models, greatest numbers, and widest coverage of cars owned by almost everyone. Thus, the public transportation is terrible, and the suburban areas are even worse than the downtown area. The streets in the satellite cities are dotted with forlorn bus stops, where not a single passenger will show up in about half an hour. And it is just like an empty city, except that cars come and go without stop, yet none of them is a bus. So the essay was written around 1988, and a copy of it was published posthumously in the Huangguan or Crown magazine in October 1996. Almost 30 years have passed, and the public transportation in Los Angeles didn't change a thing. This was what first came into my mind while I was reading this essay. And after a general description of Los Angeles in her essay, this unfinished essay then branches off to ponder the ethnic background of the person who scribbled the names We and D with a chalk on the back of a bench at a bus stop. Her speculation reveals her thorough understanding of identity politics in Asian communities in North America. And this awareness is also reflected in her bilingual writing and translation works. where she adapted her own writing for different target readers in different languages. My point is the special collection contains a significant amount of manuscripts composed during Chang's years in the United States, which is compared with her earlier work, such as the Hong Kong legend, 香港传奇, are underrepresented and understudied by scholars of modern Chinese literature as well as Asian American literature. Her English language fiction, The Rice Sprout Song, for instance, though praised by C.T. Xia, went unrecognized in the English-speaking world for a long time, and further down the line are her translation, annotation, and exegesis, such as Nightmare of the Red Chamber, 红楼梦魇, a study of a dream in the Red Chamber, and her translation of Han Buntings, The Xingxiang Girls of Shanghai, 海上花列传. Scholars have pointed out that these works, time-consuming and intellectually demanding as they may be, were commonly accepted as derivative and secondary, since the assumption is the modern concept of literature refers only to original imaginative writing. So by this logic, Zhang's translation and annotation bilingual writing, or as some scholars have called it, trans writing, featured prominently in the second half of her literary career, is a sign of her declining creativity as a diasporic writer estranged by a foreign language and a foreign culture. Henceforth, her literary career after she left mainland China in 1952 went downhill according to many. To reassess Zhang's literary achievements, David Wong suggests English provides a way for Eileen Chang to flee modern Chinese literature dominated by literary realism. He discerns that, quote, a foreign language was no more alien a medium than Chinese to transmit or translate her already alienated existence in the Chinese environment, end quote. And in her study of Eileen Chang and the Cold War, Xiaojue Wang further suggests that Zhang's translingual practice not only questioned the restraints of modern Chinese literary and political discourse, but also bespeak the equally manipulative ideological and cultural control of the Cold War United States. Recent scholarship on Zhang's translingual practices further elaborated on the significance of Zhang's translation works, such as her Chinese translation of The Old Man and the Sea by Hemingway in 1952, her English translation of Chen Jiying's Fool in the Reeds, Di Cun Zhuan at 1959, and her self-translation and rewriting of stories from her early career, such as The Golden King and The Rouge of the North. Using betrayal as a lens, Shuangshen argues that Zhang's bilingual practice shows the consciousness of the tension as well as mutual dependency of the worlds of Chinese and English. Employing self-performance through self-translation and impersonation, Zhang constantly negotiates between opposing political interests and different cultural worlds. So, to respond to the question, how the special collection helped my research, I'm going to focus on two pieces of works from the collection in this talk. And one is on the left-hand side, one is a speech Zhang delivered in English on several occasions at the State University of New York and the Radcliffe Institute between 1966 and 1969. Another on the right-hand side is the full manuscript of Zhang's English translation of The Xingxiang Girls of Shanghai, 海上花列传, accompanied by Zhang's correspondence with Stephen Sun, C.T. Xia, and Zhang Xingzhen, many of which have already been compiled and published in the past few years. And these works by Zhang demonstrate her keen awareness of the role of translation in reshaping our view of literary history. The manuscript of the speech does not have a clear title on the manuscript itself. In the 130th issue of PMLA, Christopher Lee edited and introduced this piece as, quote, Chinese translation, a vehicle of culture influence. end quote, the title of which was procured from the records at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard University. The speech begins with Mao Qingzhen's attack on a dream in the Red Chamber, which betrayed his ignorance of the significance of translation as a vehicle of culture mediation. Zhang then traces the history of Chinese translation since the end of the Opium War in the 19th century, delineating the efforts by Yan Fu and Ling to introduce Western ideology as well as Western fiction into China, following which translation has been closely associated with the idea of nation building during the May 4th movement. And subsequently, Zhang further elaborates the history of translation during the Japanese occupation, the Communist Revolution, and the Cultural Revolution, when social historical factors influenced the authors and texts targeted for inclusion and exclusion. The role of the translator is highlighted by Zhang during the process of translation and canonization of foreign literature in China. What is noteworthy here is Zhang points out the Orientalist tendency of West in cross-cultural communication, a tendency that she attempts to expose and expel in her own English writing in China. Zhang wrote to C.T. Xia after The Rouge of the North had been rejected by several publishers, quote, "I have always had a feeling those who are particularly in favor of the Orient are in love with exactly what I want to expose as illusions," end quote. And the following section, as you can see on the screen, being crossed out in the middle of the page, the following section towards the end of the speech she delivered has been crossed out in Zhang's manuscript, which reads, "The May 4th has set the tone for a rather sterilized view of the West as mentor, and now Hong Kong and Taiwan have perforce become part of the picture of worldwide Americanization, only more so because of their precarious existence. Without the disinterested exploratory enthusiasm of the May 4th, imagination needs room, it needs distance, and an absence of pressure." The crossing out of this passage indicates that she is aware of, first of all, the power dynamic between the East and West in terms of intercultural translation, and second, the precarity of Hong Kong and Taiwan in upholding intellectual impartiality within her contemporary political situation, and third, her self-censorship in realizing that delivering what she observes can be detrimental to her position as a fellowship recipient at a U.S. institute. This speech was delivered between 1966 and 1969. The period overlaps with her fellowship years at Radcliffe Institute of Independent Study, which launched her English translation project of the Xinjiang Girls of Shanghai. This project turned out to be a massive undertaking that remained incomplete till the end of her life. And so now we turn to the second piece of the work. The second piece discussed here is the full manuscript of Eileen Chang's English translation of Han Bunting's The Xinjiang Girls of Shanghai on the towards the end of the right corner. The significance of this book and Zhang's indebtedness to it are all well elaborated in many scholarly works already. In her book, Women and Chinese Modernity, The Politics of Reading Between West and East, Rachel proposes the reading of Eileen Chang's fictional writings as, quote, "an alternative approach to modernity and history through a release of sensual details whose emotional backdrop is often that of entrapment, destruction, and desolation," end quote. The feminine details in The Xinjiang Girls of Shanghai sets it apart from its contemporary depravity novels and castigatory novels through its downplaying of courtesans as sexual objects while emphasizing on their agency within larger social constraints, and through showcasing the world of objects as commodities associated with their identity as courtesans, further strengthening their identity as high-class courtesans in the colonial space of Shanghai. This model of writing wrote the Mandarin duck and butterfly novels in the following few decades and nurtures writers like Eileen Chang and her disciples. The full manuscript of the English translation of it in the special collection was dated circa 1975, and it was later edited by Eva Hahn and published by Columbia University Press in 2005. Regarding Zhang's contribution as a translator in this project, I'd like to discuss it with the Mandarin translation together. So these are the Mandarin translations on the left-hand side. Shan Dexing concludes that Zhang's role as a translator can be divided into two types. One, that of an intralingual translator from the original Wu dialect into Mandarin, and that of an interlingual translator from Chinese into English. In terms of intralingual translation, Zhang's Mandarin translation and annotation can be viewed in the tradition of re-excavating dialect writing since the May 4th period, and the reprinting and annotation of the Qing Dynasty dialect fiction, such as He Dian, which classic in the early Republican period, is also an example in this sense. Following Hu Shi's effort to re-excavate Haishanghua, Lie Zhuan, Zhang provides her analysis of the book's lukewarm reception in the book market in the postscript of the Mandarin translation that goes beyond pure linguistic limitations but points directly to the stylistic feature of Han's writing. In terms of interlingual translation, though the manuscript is unfinished here, the volume of existing text, which is 848 pages in total, as well as Zhang's revisions, provided us with evidences to examine. From Zhang's correspondence with C.T. Xia, Stephen Sun, and Richard McCarthy, we see this project has been a frequently visited topic, especially regarding how it has constantly been delayed in the process of translation. The letter sent to McCarthy on December 16, 1983 by Zhang further explains how the English translation project coincided with her relocation, frustration with fleas, and deterioration of health condition, and thus remained unfinished until the end of her life. So, existing scholarship on Zhang and Han's translation of the Xingzang Girls of Shanghai is basically based on the published version by Columbia University Press due to the unavailability of this manuscript. And scholars have already pointed out the structural changes Zhang made when translating the work for readers of different linguistic and cultural backgrounds. And thanks to the special collection, I am currently working on comparing and contrasting these different versions of translation to see Zhang's adaptation and translation strategies of this masterpiece for the Anglophone readers. A close look at the manuscript shows us how meticulous Zhang is with the word choice. For instance, the translation of Hong Shanxing's name, a male protagonist from the book, went from rectitude Hong to benevolence Hong to better capture the personality of the protagonist. To conclude, I appreciate the USC Library's efforts to make the Eileen Chang papers available to the public. By the time I graduated from USC in 2018, the manuscripts were made available online while quite a few of pieces of articles went unrecognized in the database. But before today's talk, I went back to check the special collection database again and found that all of them have been carefully identified and dated already, and you can find sufficient information about each item in the collection. So with the promotion of such rare sources, I hope to see more research on Eileen Chang's contribution to the Sinophone as well as Anglophone literary arena, particularly in the second half of her life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Yunwen Gao. That was really wonderful and a great way to kick us off for today's program. I really appreciate your very close reading of Zhang Eiling's works, and I think it will be a nice foil to my presentation, which will provide a kind of kaleidoscopic view of the general cultural milieu in which Zhang Eiling worked and to which she contributed. First, I just want to say hello to everyone, and thank you so much for having me and for coming today. It's really inspiring to be here today, surrounded virtually by such brilliant scholars, writers, artists, and curators from all over the world. We're all here in different time zones and separated by seas, and yet we've come together to collectively celebrate the 100th birth year of Zhang Eileen, also known as Eileen Chang. So happy birthday to her. I want to thank my co-organizer, Tong Li. This project would absolutely not have been possible without her. She is the mastermind behind it all. So thank you so much, Tong. I truly appreciate this opportunity. All right, so I will begin my talk now. Let me share my screen. And please, if anybody has any questions, put them in that Q&A function. Our moderator will kindly be looking at that as we go along, so you can drop them in. Okay, can everybody see my screen okay? All right. So the title of my talk is Cross-Cultural Art and Design in Eileen Chang's Golden Shanghai. And it starts drawing from my book, recently published, Above Sea, Contemporary Art, Urban Culture, and the Fashioning of Global Shanghai, which is an exploration of Shanghai's turn of the 21st century art and cultural production. And yet, in researching Shanghai's recent visual culture, I found it necessary, like so many of the contemporary artists and designers that I discuss in the book, to look back to Shanghai during its Republican era, the period in which Zhang Eileen lived and wrote. As I write in the conclusion, a key theorist of Chinese modernity, author Zhang Eileen grew up in Republican Shanghai and later relocated to Hong Kong and ultimately to Los Angeles. In Lust, Caution, what director Ang Lee, who adapted the novella to film, calls Zhang's most beautiful and cruel story, a Chinese patriot betrays her country over love perceived through a dazzling diamond ring. An Indian-owned jewelry store in Shanghai, and the store's windows onto the cinematic city, set the stage for this tale's climax, wherein the heroine decides to save the Japanese sympathizer she has been seducing with the covert intention of assassinating. Zhang writes, inside, she could hear only the muffled buzz of the city outside because of the war. There were fewer cars on the road than usual. Though she was vaguely aware that something was about to happen, her heavy head was telling her that it must all be a dream. She examined the ring under the lamplight, turning it over in her fingers. Sitting by the balcony, she began to imagine that the bright windows and door visible behind her were a cinema screen across which an action movie was being shown, end quote. In writing on espionage, sex, and love in foreign-occupied Shanghai, Zhang defined modernity in relationship to the city's hybrid spaces, imported material possessions, and internationally informed human subjectivities. Zhang's writings picture Shanghai as a hotbed of collisions between local and international concerns that crystallized in the city's foreign-run locales and allures. Highlighting Shanghai's cultural eclecticism as both sparkling and sinister, Zhang foreshadowed with grave intensity our current climate in which transnational exchanges both fuel and threaten the world's major cities and feature prominently in artistic content and production. The tragic annihilation of Lust, Caution's heroine finally reveals that Shanghai's fashionable hybrids constitute explosive entanglements. At the turn of the 21st century, Shanghai's city officials and public relations executives celebrated the so-called golden years of Shanghai captured in Zhang's writings. Such celebrations of Shanghai's East meets West Republican era past are epitomized in spaces such as Xintiandi, an outdoor shopping complex located in Shanghai's former French concession and said to exemplify Shanghai's East meets West spirit. Visitors from outside Shanghai or outside of China are often struck by Xintiandi's positioning of global chains and rampant consumerism, situated directly beside the historic site of China's first communist meeting, now turned into a museum that is sandwiched between Xintiandi's Tomorrow, a sleek glass-clad shopping mall, and Yesterday, a group of buildings that are recreated in the vernacular architectural style of the city's semi-colonial era, Shukumen and Longtong, or Stone Gate homes and alleyways. Related to Xintiandi's branding campaign, the complex's development group, the Hong Kong-based group Shui'an, in consultation with architectural historians from Shanghai's Tongji University, established the Shukumen Open House Museum on the site's premises. Located in a reconstructed Shukumen, the museum is designed to look like a private home of a bourgeois family living in Shanghai's elite French concession during the Republican era. At the museum's entrance, wall plaques detail how dilapidated the Shukumen homes had been before Xintiandi's construction began, praising the development project for restoring the neighborhood to its old Shanghai glory. Not surprisingly, the plaques do not explain that the construction project destroyed a great deal of the site's pre-existing Shukumen, while also displacing thousands of residents. The museum's interior is staged with photographs, furniture, and daily household items, many of which are originals from the 1930s. One room is modeled to look as if it had belonged to a young woman. On her vanity sit makeup containers and jewelry boxes, photographs of smiling girls, a lamp, and an oil painting of birds. A magazine featuring a Chinese cover star is laid out just beneath an issue of Photoplay, a US film magazine featuring a Hollywood starlet. The display conjures the cosmopolitan modernity of Republican Shanghai as it was defined by writers like Zhang Ling through the figure of the modern woman and fashions that fused Chinese tradition and foreign influence. In contrast to the museum's lavishly decorated rooms, there is one small chamber set at the staircase's bend that contains nothing more than a modest bed, chair, and wooden desk with all the necessary tools for writing. A plaque tells visitors that, beginning in the early 1920s, many writers associated with the New Culture movement rented out and worked in these small rooms. The room is presented as the perfect private space for unencumbered creative freedom, nowhere referencing the bloody persecutions these revolutionary writers endured and wrote about. Writer and art critic Liu Xuan, a leader of the New Culture movement who lived in Shanghai in the 1920s to 30s, reminds us that violence and torture existed as dangerously invisible undersides of Shanghai's modernity during the period recreated by the Shukumen Open House Museum. Liu Xuan wrote from Shanghai in the aftermath of the White Terror campaign of 1931 to 1934, when nationalist parties, aided by the foreign district's police officers, severely crippled the communist Shanghai base by conducting over 100,000 arrests and numerous executions of those accused of leftist agitation. He compared Shanghai's realities to Dante's Inferno. Quote, "I was amazed by the tortures Dante had conceived, but now, with more experience, I understand that he was kind. He never conceived of a hell so cruel that nobody can see it, which is so common today," end quote. For Liu Xuan, one of the most alarming parts of Shanghai's fractured social structure in the 1930s was how easily the city's poverty and violence could be hidden from view. Zhang Ling, while sometimes criticized for being less overtly political than writers like Liu Xuan, nonetheless tackled turbulent and sometimes hidden socio-political conditions. Through intimate narratives of fraught relationships and familial distress, often set in quiet apartments or shops in foreign districts, Zhang ruminated on the inequities wrought by colonial occupation and oppressive patriarchy in the war-torn cityscapes of Hong Kong and Shanghai. In 1937, artist Tsai Ruohong depicted Avenue Joffrey, or present-day Huaihai Lu, the main commercial street of Shanghai's former French concession, as a site of extreme disparity, where overfed foreigners shop for imported fashions, while Chinese children, reduced to the status of dogs, subsist in rags, women work as hardened prostitutes and begging mothers, and young men are violently hauled off to jail by the French-run police force. This cartoon was published in the Shanghai-based journal Tiansha Monthly and accompanied by an article on young Shanghai-based artists whose, quote, keen social outlook was most strongly affected by the brutalities of the Shanghai jungle, end quote. In the late 1930s, down a side street in the French Concession at 90 Rue Marcel Tilliot stood a rehearsal space utilized by some of Shanghai's best-known leftist actors and filmmakers, including the director Yuan Muzhe, whose 1937 film Street Angel narrates the plight of working-class denizens and reveals dire contrasts between Shanghai's glamorizing signs of cosmopolitan modernity and destitute slum-level realities. Street Angel's opening credits run over urban scenes flashing in rapid succession, neon signs in Chinese and English, birds flying over the city, people strolling in a park, moviegoers, a band on parade, churches' pointy spires, fireworks, dance halls, crowded trams, bright street lamps, the neoclassical customs house. I'll let you see some of these. Oops. One moment, sorry, turn back on my camera. And finally, as the montage shows us, we see the chief symbols of Shanghai's imported capitalism. That is a pair of bronze lions flanking the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation on Shanghai's Bund, the city's colonial waterfront and the heart of the international settlement. Following this montage, the viewers face a gleaming Art Deco skyscraper. The camera films the modest skyscraper from top to bottom before plunging underground, and the subtitles, "The Slums of Shanghai," appear. Sharing Yuan Muzhe's rehearsal space in the Shanghai's French Concession was the Storm Society, China's first self-proclaimed avant-garde art and design group, founded by Ni Yide and Peng Shenqin, a painter who had come to Shanghai in 1931 after studying in art and design in Paris. Peng Shenqin's interest in design and embrace of both cultural and media hybridity supported the Storm Society's broader goals of uniting art and life. He championed the Art Deco and Bauhaus movements, which he had studied firsthand in Paris. In 1931, Peng created a watercolor bearing two titles, "Such is Shanghai" and "The Riddle of Life." This watercolor integrates the lessons Peng gleaned while living in Paris, such as the surrealist transformation of everyday objects into occult symbols, the creation of a diaphanous, oniric tableau, and the picturing of chances lost in the modern city through the figure of the enigmatic women. Despite these nods to the current French culture in which the young artist had just been immersed, the watercolor fashions a multi-layered landscape particular to Shanghai by layering imagery associated with the city's reputation as China's most international, cosmopolitan, and sexually open and vice-ridden metropolis. Of the young women pictured here, two have Han Chinese features, while the other, blonde and blue-eyed, has a floral crown-like detail above her head that turns her into a queen of hearts. Superimposition, crafted through skilled watercolor techniques, makes the woman's face disappear and appear and dissolve all at once. They might be dancing girls, movie starlets, or prostitutes. Here we find a clue in the flower tucked behind the most prominent face in the foreground, and by the petals clenched in a candlelit fist in the painting's bottom corner. Flowers in Chinese literature often suggested sexual availability by punning on the term flower girl, a Chinese euphemism for prostitute, linked to the late Qing Dynasty courtesans featured in Sing Song Girls, a novel Eileen would spend her later years translating. As in a collage-like painting, Zhang's literary works present clashes between Chinese tradition and modernity through nuanced narratives that foreground women, familial dynamics, love, lust, danger, and caution, often set in stifling domestic and retail interiors. The landing page of the virtual exhibition celebrating Zhang's life and legacy that we will proudly launch later today consists of a collage constructed by USC undergraduate student and Roski School of Design major Sophia Almandral. The collage gives the visitor a sense they are sifting through the rich materials in the special collections of Eileen Chang's papers in USC's library. We see fragments of Zhang's letters to Columbia University professor C.T. Shaw, a literary critic who helped make her work known throughout the United States, and on an envelope, the author's return address in West Hollywood, where she would finally settle. We see references, we see the actual document that Professor Yunwen Gao brought up, where Zhang Eileen complains of the traffic in Los Angeles. And we see this fragment of the speech that she gave at Radcliffe that Professor Gao also mentioned, in which she discusses the importance of translation and cross-cultural studies. USC undergraduate student, philosophy, politics, and economics major Anya Chung recommended a line from this speech as the title of the students' exhibition. Quote, "The Arabian Nights, The Vicar of Wakefield, Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, and Sherlock Holmes, all in classical Chinese, that beautiful dead language," and that beautiful dead language is crossed out, "like a reflection in a bronze mirror." In the collage of In a Bronze Mirror, Eileen Chang's life and literature, we see photographs of Zhang, her grandmother, and with her friend Ying Yan, and ever present, Zhang's fashion. The font of the exhibition's main titles recall the Art Deco style ubiquitous in Zhang's Republican-era Shanghai, while the exhibition's primary color scheme draws from her 1943 essay, Chinese Life and Fashions. In her illustrated essay, Zhang describes the enticing peach and liquid red shades of small jackets worn in bed, as well as the, quote, slow, smooth, gold-embroidered world of the annual ritual of bringing family clothes out into the sun. Zhang writes, quote, "Come and see the Chinese family on the day when the clothes are handed down for generations and given their annual sunning. The dust that has settled over the strife and strain of lives lived long ago is shaken out and set dancing in the yellow sun." One of the exhibition's displays focuses on Chinese life and fashions, wherein Zhang defines Chinese modernity as being in fashion, which in Republican Shanghai meant hybridizing national tradition, foreign references, and urbane cosmopolitanism, represented in her characters' outward appearances and outlooks, and in the spaces they inhabit. Zhang's stories and theories of modernity, which frequently position Shanghai as their primary protagonist, reveal the city's so-called golden era to be at once gleaming and dust-ridden. As our keynote speaker today, the distinguished Professor Ray Chow brilliantly observes in Woman and Chinese Modernity, the Politics of Reading Between West and East, Chinese life and fashions provides much more than a study of fashion. This essay crafts a theory of Chinese modernity that is linked to the steady elimination of superfluous detail and, together with Zhang's other writings, set her apart as an author capable of illuminating cultural, social, and political conditions through intensely personal reflections. Inspired by Professor Ray Chow's text, a detail of Zhang's clothing pictured in this portrait here was extracted and made under the design expertise of Remy Wedden and Curtis Fletcher, our heroes in the Amundsen Lab, who offered their invaluable support in designing the exhibition. It was made into the reflective light background that appears in each design and each exhibition display. These are the details that together constitute an extraordinary life and a vast body of multivalent work, and the details that the curators highlight in the virtual exhibition we unveil later today as a celebration of Zhang's life, literature, and cross-cultural legacies. Thank you very much. And I will hand it over to my colleague, Professor Brian Bernards.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And I'd just like to say that it's so wonderful to see Eileen Chang's legacy interpreted and come to life, not just through the literary translation and cinematic adaptation formats that I'm more familiar with, but also through modern urban space, through architecture, art, design, and fashion. So it's truly my honor and privilege today to speak on the occasion of Eileen Chang's Centennial. I'd like to first acknowledge Professor Jenny Lin and USC's Chinese librarian Tang Li for organizing this wonderful event. I encourage all of you to take the opportunity to peruse this fascinating collection that Tang and Professor Dominic Chung helped curate. And I want to begin with the caveat here that I do not consider myself an Eileen Chang scholar per se. My primary research is on the post-colonial literary archive of Chinese migration, settlement, and interethnic exchange in Southeast Asia. And in conducting this research, I most often encounter Eileen Chang's legacy and influence as a point of intertextual reference for Sinophone writers from Southeast Asia. So my talk today is actually inspired by my reading of one of the handwritten expository essays that Eileen Chang wrote during her final years in Los Angeles. And this is the one that now Yunwen and Jenny have both mentioned. It's simply titled 1988 or Ijiu Ba Ba Zhi. And this handwritten essay, as mentioned, is part of the Eileen Chang Papers collection of the USC Digital Library. This essay inspired me to go back and revisit the figure of the Huaqiao, or overseas Chinese, in Zhang's earlier Shanghai-based canonical fiction, especially the 1943 short story or novella, Red Rose, White Rose, Hong Mei Gui, Bai Mei Gui. So I see Zhang's evolving literary interest in the Huaqiao figure as linked to the modernist literary aesthetics that other pioneering scholars of her work have identified throughout her transnational and translational life from Shanghai to Hong Kong to Los Angeles. In this brand of modernism, the Huaqiao figure manifests ambivalent emplacement against a backdrop of perpetual displacement. And Zhang's writing of the Huaqiao figure exceeds her fictional exploration of cosmopolitan expressions of romance and courtship in modern Chinese literature. Her inter-Asian and trans-Pacific translation of the Huaqiao figure underscores the author's self-positioning as a narrative translator who captures subtle arrays of difference, but does not equate such difference with assertions of cultural incommensurability or otherness. So in Shanghai Modern, Liu Ofan Li elaborates on Zhang's 1943 response to a critique from the literary translator Fu Lei. And Fu Lei accused Zhang's writing of consistently fallible figures as being more decadent farce than art. And in an essay, in this essay entitled My Writing, or Ziji de Wen Zhang, Zhang writes, quote, I like plainness and simplicity, but I can only describe the basic human simplicity that filters through modern fashions and ideas. I don't make falsehood and truth into stark opposites. Instead, through 层次的对照, I show truth amid the falsehood of our times and simplicity amid the sumptuousness of superficial appearances. Here, 层次的对照 refers to subtle, not direct directly oppositional contrasts. Li describes the practice as, quote, contrast in decadence, a narrative technique of contrasting two things, not in a mutually oppositional way, but in a sort of uneven, mismatched fashion. The contrast in decadence produces what Li calls an aesthetic state of sorrowful and cold desolation, or tangliang. Now, rather than the iconoclastic impulse towards large-scale revolution against the old order characteristic of intellectual writers of the time, this cold desolation implies what Li calls, quote, a revelation, an epiphany that discloses a plain truth. In chapter 3 of her book, Not Like a Native Speaker, today's keynote speaker, Professor Ray Chow, suggests that we can view the narrative voice of Chinese literary modernity as a type of translator rather than simply as a storyteller. In this sense, Zhang Eiling's aesthetic state of cold desolation serves as an alternative translation strategy to the type of inequitable translation that Ray Chow observes in the work of Ba Jin. In her earlier book on woman in Chinese modernity, Chow identified Eileen Chang's sensuously local and immediate nonconformist approach to narration. Viewing this as a mode of narrative translation, I'm interested in how this nonconformist approach may help us uncover an irony in Zhang's construction of Huaqiao characters, who at a superficial level appear sometimes as conventionally cliched stereotypes. In 1999, one of the foremost historians of the Chinese diaspora, the Singaporean scholar Wang Gungwu, located the cultural expressions and identities of the Huaqiao along a spectrum of cosmopolitan cities from Shanghai to Hong Kong to Singapore to San Francisco. For Wang, these expressions serve as testaments to the globally diverse expressions and practices of, quote, Chineseness. Each of these cities are connected along an inter-Asian and trans-Pacific post-colonial capitalist network. Given that Eileen Chang's own life movements circulated along an analogous trajectory, it should not be surprising that Huaqiao figure prominently as narrative propellants in her fiction. Of course, the term Huaqiao embeds a China-centric perspective, implying the displacement of the overseas Chinese perpetually away from the homeland. Zhang, as a Shanghai native, first constructs the Huaqiao in her fiction as visitors and returnees to her hometown. Now, building from Wang's spectrum model, we can see a typology of various Huaqiao figures in Zhang's fiction. They're compared through contrasts in decadence, not just to each other, but they're analogized with others whose expressions of discrepant Chineseness are similarly emplaced according to what Wang Gungwu calls the dilemmas of place and practice. For an inter-Asian and trans-Pacific reading of Zhang's Huaqiao figures as narrative catalysts, I first consider the Singapore Huaqiao or South Seas or Nanyang Chinese as constructed in Red Rose, White Rose, and then the American Huaqiao in the 1988 essay. At first glance, Zhang's strategy of subtle contrast would not apply to the title of Red Rose, White Rose. Here, in fact, it is the stark contrast of the red and the white to which Zhang calls our attention. Now, in referring to this text, in English, I'll be referring to Karen Kingsbury's fantastic translation in the Love in a Fallen City volume. The names Red Rose and White Rose are actually nicknames that the protagonist of the story, Zhenbao, a recently returned student to Shanghai, devises for his two love interests. Red Rose refers to Jiao Rui, a Singaporean Huaqiao and wife of one of Zhenbao's former classmates in England. Zhenbao sees Jiao Rui as the reincarnation of his Eurasian ex-girlfriend in England, whose name indeed was Rose. He likens Jiao Rui to Rose because, quote, there really weren't many women of this sort, not among the pure Chinese, or Chunsui Zhongguoren. Zhenbao, quote, liked women who were fiery and impetuous, the kind you couldn't marry. Here was one, Jiao Rui, who was already a wife. This setup establishes the basis for Zhenbao's steamy affair with Zhao Rui. Zhenbao sees Zhao Rui as a sensuous yet unstable seductress with a tropical Southeast Asian flair. The analogy with Rose's mixed Europeanness through Zhao Rui's British colonial subjectivity is adorned with the markings of her creolization with indigenous Southeast Asian culture. Zhao Rui wears clothes associated with the Nonya women of the Malay archipelago, who bear traces of mixed Malay and Chinese heritage. Quote, she was wearing pajamas made out of a sarong fabric, often worn by overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, and it looked like she had just come from her bath. The design on the fabric was so heavy and dark that he couldn't tell whether it was snakes and dragons or grasses and trees, the lines and vines all tangled up together, black and gold, flecked with orange and green. In this exoticized tropical flair of a Nanyang Huaqiao construction, Zhao Rui is only suitable for an affair or a temporary ethical deviation from Zhenbao's, quote, pure Chinese norms. As for Zhao Rui's cuckolded Shanghainese husband, Shi Hong, he is shown belittling his wife in his only interactions with Zhenbao, suggesting that those Huaqiao, quote, those Huaqiao have the bad habits of the Chinese and the bad habits of the foreigners as well. The narrative attention on Zhao Rui's sloppy Chinese calligraphy presents her as childlike and unsophisticated in the eyes of the Shanghainese. For her part, Zhao Rui resents constantly being othered and ridiculed by her husband. Quote, it's always they, them, those overseas Chinese. Don't call me them. Zhao Rui's fury retort is partially what attracts Zhenbao to her. Yet after the affair's dissolution, Zhenbao's later marriage to his so-called White Rose, referring to the, quote, properly Chinese Yan Li, sets up yet another superficial and trivial contrast. Zhang's depiction of Yan Li is even less forgiving than Zhao Rui's. Yan Li's, quote, whiteness signifies not just safety and dull sterility, as she is likened to a portable hospital screen. It also embodies a sense of mourning, of loss or decay, reminding Zhenbao of his mortality since he's become condemned to a life of domestic boredom and he turns to sleeping with sex workers in a futile attempt to revive youthful passions. Shumei Shi sees the red rose, white rose dichotomy as articulating a type of sinophone intervention in the construction of Chinese literary modernity. By setting up, quote, an opposition between them Huaqiao and us Chinese, the Nanyang Huaqiao serve as, quote, figurative foils for what it means to be at once modern and Chinese. Now, to align Shi's observation of the stark opposition in characterization with Zhang's narrative strategy of subtle contrast, it is Zhang's construction of the shallow superficiality and fallibility of Zhenbao's modern self-orientalizing judgments of them Huaqiao and us Chinese that are subtly ironic, as his figurative return to Shanghai after schooling abroad winds up sentencing him to perpetual displacement in his own hometown. 45 years after the publication of Red Rose, White Rose, Eileen Chang was living in seclusion in Los Angeles and refusing media interviews, just as her life's work was being rediscovered in mainland China and reappreciated throughout the Sinophone world. At this time, she handwrote a casual expository essay that would be published posthumously in an October 1996 issue of Hong Kong's Crown magazine. Given Zhang's seclusion, the essay, simply titled 1988 to ? Is almost diary-like, seemingly written as much for herself, though it does begin with the flavor of a casual informational travelogue that Yunwen graciously read for us and translated. For Zhang, LA's automobile-worshipping sprawl gives it more the feel of a region than a coherent city. This is a source of resentment for Zhang, who cannot drive and must rely on the city's notoriously unreliable mass transit system. The essay starts to read like the cinematic stage openings of one of her classic stories. Zhang describes a desolate bus stop on a dry, sunny afternoon in what she calls a dormitory city or bedroom district, essentially a residential suburb. She describes the surrounding hills as barren and brownish green. She spots cars on a distant freeway overpass and describes the various shops across the street. After setting up this desolate scene, Zhang zooms in on an inconspicuously subtle detail: graffiti written in white chalk on the green bus stop bench where she waits impatiently for the unreliable bus. The graffiti is written in English, and it simply states, "We in D, 1988 to when." Perhaps because of the dullness of the moment, this sparks Zhang's curiosity. She assumes We and D are the surnames of American Huaqiao, suspecting that We is the Mandarin way. Then she muses on the various ways that Huaqiao surnames are transliterated. Some Huaqiao surnames have intriguing spellings, as they are based on Minnan or Cantonese. Di could also be the Mandarin Dai, just as the two possible surnames for Wei could also be another more common surname, something totally unanticipated. I've heard that many refugees from Southeast Asia live in this valley, but I don't know why they'd choose this place where the rent is rather expensive. Of course, there are different socioeconomic classes among the refugee community, but bus passengers are typically among the rather poor. Here, Zhang notes the diversity of American Huaqiao, which also, for her, would include Sino-Vietnamese who arrived via Vietnam. She also notes the diversity of Sinitic language influences on their cultural practices and expressions. Now, whether or not We and D are indeed of Chinese descent is less relevant here than Zhang's motivation to construct them narratively as Huaqiao figures with whom she draws an affinity through a shared sense of boredom and desolation at an LA bus stop. But she also draws a cultural contrast through their peculiar graffiti practice. Zhang finds it curious that We and D use their family names rather than their given names, as she assumes given names would be more typical for these types of public love declarations among American youth. She speculates that perhaps they thought their given names were too generic, even though she feels that most Chinese believe that announcing one's surname in this fashion would be too revealing. It would be too traceable, especially in a small suburb of the city like this, where most of the members of the Chinese migrant community likely knew each other. Zhang's afternoon reverie takes a stylistic turn toward fictional narrative, as she imagines that We used chalk that he nicked from his English cram school. She seems certain that We is male and is the one who wrote the inscription. And Zhang resolves in her mind that this was a fleeting moment in which We threw caution to the wind to declare his love. Quote, "Our sons and daughters who live in troubled times, encountering someone from their ancestral land in another land, who knows what their future will be? It depends on personal circumstances." Honing in on this phrase, Zhang Yiwu, a scholar of Chinese literature at Peking University, writes in his blog that this moment reflects Zhang's identification with the fatalistic figure of the wandering Chinese. He believes that We and D are like reincarnations of Fan Liuyuan and Bai Liu Su from Love in a Fallen City. I rather see 1988 as Zhang evoking a creolizing expression of both romantic declaration and lonely locational inscription, one that recalls the type of markings that detained Chinese migrants etched on the walls of their holding cells in San Francisco's Angel Island during an earlier era of Chinese exclusion. Through this imagined displacement, the frustrated waiting of We and D, Eileen Chang works through, perhaps, her own sense of desolation with an imagined narrative of affirmative yet unpredictable emplacement. We were here and we loved each other, but who knows what our fate will hold. From the Nanyang Huaqiao in Red Rose, White Rose to the American Huaqiao in 1988, over 40 years later, Zhang's inter-Asian and trans-Pacific imagination and translation of Huaqiao figures works between and through the Sinophone boundaries of other and self in their transnational literary fashioning. Thank you. Oh, and now I'll turn it over to Geraldine Fiss to moderate the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much for 3 wonderful presentations. And thank you especially to Tang-Li and Lynn for putting together this amazing event and also for working so hard to make the Eileen Chang archive at USC available to scholars around the world. So it is an honor and a joy for me to participate in this centennial celebration of Eileen Chang's life and work today. The three wonderful presentations we have just heard are a clear testament to the fact that Eileen Chang's legacy is vibrantly alive and continues to exert a potent force upon thinkers, writers, and creative innovators in fields as diverse as literary fiction, design, art, and fashion. What Brian, Jenny, and Yunwen also reveal is that Eileen Chang herself moved among and across a variety of very different spaces, which each affected her sensibilities and her work in distinct ways. She began her writing life in Shanghai, the city she loved the most, when she was in fact a chronicler of sorts, not of political issues of the day, but of stories of love and everyday life, particularly the everyday life of middle-class petty urbanite, 小市民, and particularly women in Shanghai in the 1940s. One outstanding example of her work during this early period, which Brian already mentioned, is the story Sealed Off, 封锁, from 1941, in which she really beautifully evokes the psychological depth that lies beneath the surface of external reality. Due to the trauma of war and historical circumstances, Eileen Chang then lived and wrote in Hong Kong, where she constructed, in fact, an alternative narrative of war in the indelible story, Qing Cheng Zhilian, Love in a Fallen City, in 1942, and many other stories as well. Denigrated and misunderstood, she was then forced to leave her homeland and spent the rest of her life in exile in Los Angeles, where she spent many years writing, revising, and also translating, among others, her great novella, Last Caution, 死戒, which was then published in 1979. The reason why I remind you once more of this itinerary of Eileen Chang's life is to draw your attention to her unwavering efforts to perceive, reflect, and refract true, authentic, lived reality. No matter where in the world she finds herself, she succeeds in revealing the inner desolation, 黄粱, that Brian already mentioned, within people's minds and hearts, focusing on the intricacies of love between one man and one woman, or the pain of betrayal, or the loss of certitude and even self-knowledge amid the turmoil of war. At the same time, Chung also constantly engages in the kind of cosmopolitan trans writing that both Brian and Yunwen have highlighted. As Yunwen shows us, Zhang's work in translation, annotation, and bilingual writing, in fact, enriches her literary artistry, while also expanding immeasurably the repertoire of and possibilities for contemporary and future Chinese writers, and particularly women writers. In other words, as Brian, Jenny, and Yunwen reveal, it is precisely this oftentimes painful but necessary movement between different spaces in a discordant world that accounts for the enduring power of Eileen Chang's cross-cultural legacy and impact. And it is very beautiful to see that we have Sinophone writers who are inspired by elements of Zhang's literary aesthetic, and using these as a kind of translation strategy to really create new kinds of texts in the, for example, in the Southeast Asian literary context, as Brian just described. And it's also wonderful to see the students at USC who are going to show us their creative work today, who are also inspired by Eileen Chang's aesthetic and writings. Throughout Eileen Chang's entire oeuvre, it is clear that her main priority is to stay as close as possible to authentic, true, lived reality by means of focusing on details. In fact, in her essay, which Brian just referred to as well, 自己的文章, my own writing, Zhang writes, in my fiction, my characters are not heroes, but they carry the general burden of this age. Although they are not absolute, they're serious. They have no tragic grandeur, they have only desolation. Tragic grandeur is a form of closure, but desolation is revelation. as Brian also told us very beautifully in his talk. In the same essay, she declares, "I know that my works lack force, but since I am a fiction writer, I can only express the energies of the characters in my fiction, but cannot create force on their behalf. Besides, I believe that although they are weak, the average people are not as forceful as heroes. It is precisely these average people who can better represent, more so than heroes, the sum total of this age." Finally, she declares very confidently, "I like simplicity and plainness, but I can only describe the basic human simplicity that filters through the modern fashion and ideas. I don't make falsehoods and truth into stark opposites." And this is a very, very important point. In his book, Shanghai Modern, Liu Li allows us to gain further insight into Eileen Chang's feeling use of a multitude of details. With her details, Zhang forces our attention to those material signifiers that serve not only to tell a different story about Shanghai's urban life, but also to reconfigure the spaces of the city, private, public, small, and large, in accordance with her own vision. Ray Chow, in her own critical work, Woman and Chinese Modernity, allows us to even more deepen our understanding of the importance of quotidian detail in Zhang's texts. Zhang's world of detail, writes Chow, is always already broken from the presumed whole. It is, quote, "that which is itself cut off, incomplete, desolate, but which is at the same time sensuously local and immediate, rather than the wholeness of idealist notions like man, self, or China." Ray Chow shows us that Chang portrays these sensuous, trivial, and superfluous textual presences that exist, in fact, in ambiguous relation with some larger vision, such as reform and revolution, which seeks to subordinate them, but which is displaced by their surprising returns. So I think that is a common theme that I detect also in your talk, Brian, that there's a surprising return that occurs again and again of something that could be suppressed as well. As Brian, Jenny, and Yunwen have shown us today, this concern with authenticity, a hesitancy to draw a clear distinction between falsehood and truth, revelation of desolation, and her feeling use of this technique of contrast in decadence, 层次的对照, very much lie at the heart of Eileen Chang's fiction and all of her literary texts, as well as her thoughts about writing, and her reflections on art, design, space, and architecture, which really suffuse all of her literary texts. Finally, I would like to conclude these brief remarks by evoking a central metaphor for Eileen Chang's works. This metaphor is that she herself conceived of her fiction as words on water, words written on water. As Nicole Huang points out in the introduction to a beautiful volume entitled Written on Water, which contains many of Eileen Chang's essays that were translated by Andrew Jones as well as Nicole Huang, Eileen Chang explains the implications of this metaphor in one of her essays. She does not expect her writing to endure. Instead, her work should be thought of as words written on water, or flowing words. Liu Yan. A more literal translation of Liu Yan would be lingering momentarily or eventually fading. But she also hopes that her writing will be endowed with the spirit of rumors or gossip, a second denotation of the word Liu Yan, flowing freely and swiftly in order to reach the widest possible audience. So with that, I would like to actually turn to spend some time on a Q&A on these wonderful talks. And I would like to take this moment to ask questions of each of our presenters. So first of all, Yunwen, thank you very much for your wonderful, deeply illuminating talk. I very much look forward to reading your book. And my question for you is that as you show, Eileen Chang is in fact a very important diasporic writer, precisely because of her, because she engages in trans writing in the second half of her career. So I'm wondering if you could say a few more words about how her translations, annotations, how her bilingual writing practice, in fact, opens up a space of new creativity and innovation. I know that you discussed this very much in your book-length manuscript, in which you focus very closely on language and dialect, right? But so my question really is, how does English, in fact, provide a way for her to flee modern Chinese literary dominance of literary realism, which is the point that David Wang makes, but how does it at the same time allow her to kind of seek to escape this Orientalist tendency of the West in cross-cultural communication that you mentioned in your talk? So if you could say a few more words about this particular power dynamic. And you also mentioned the key themes of betrayal, self-performance, and impersonation, which are so much at the heart of the novella and also the film Lust, Caution. So I wonder whether you could say a few more words with respect to this act of trans writing and also using English, particularly with respect to the text Lust, Caution. For Brian, for Jenny, I have a number of questions, and audience members also have a number of questions for you. So I was very intrigued by the clip that you showed us, by these scenes in which the white Chinese writing was superimposed upon the images in the film. So I'm actually wondering if you could say a little bit more about this particular technique and what is the aesthetic that it kind of brings about, because you mentioned this cosmopolitan modernity of Eileen Chang, and that it kind of becomes transformed onto the visual medium in some ways, and that there is kind of a resonance, a connection to Eileen Chang's work in many of these films that are partially based on her texts and partially, of course, new creations. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about these particular film scenes. And one of our audience members also asked in the Q&A, she noted that the film, of course, the films that you showed were silent films. So I'm wondering, as the visual medium turned to sound, was there a change that you observed in terms of technique? Is there some kind of visual innovative technique that happens in film that yet again establishes a link to Eileen Chang? And then for Brian, my question for you, Brian, is, of course, I'm deeply interested in this aesthetic state of cold desolation as a translation strategy, which you so beautifully highlight. And I imagine that that you are looking at this very closely with respect to these Sinophone writers, in particular Li Tianbao, Li Zishu, and Lim Chin Chao, I think is his name. So I wonder if you can say a little bit more about this irony in the depiction of Huaqiao characters that you already explained to us and described to us in your talk, because it is really truly interesting that she is using, that this cold desolation is used as a kind of translation strategy, and that you see that very clearly being done, and that there's a kind of an ironic effect in some of these Sinophone writers' texts. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about this rather nonconformist approach and its effect. And then, of course, we also have questions from the audience about this technique of contrast in decadence, 层次的对照. And I know that it is quite hard to explain. And I wonder whether you can say a few more words, if you can explain a little bit more what 层次的对照 is, how she thought about it, how we see it in her texts, how she uses a very feeling portrayal of color in order to distinguish the yellow of the walls from a settled peach color that is slightly different. So what is the emotional meaning and resonance of that? How does Eileen Chang use it? And how do you see Sinophone writers, to some extent, also adapting this technique? If you could maybe first respond to these questions, and then I'd like to turn to some more questions that our audience members brought to our attention. So maybe Yunwen, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you very much, Geraldine, for raising these points. These are really good points, and I'd like to mention a few texts to respond to your questions regarding the bilingual writing and also translation that she has done in the second half of her life, which I think is contributing a lot to the creativity or our ways of understanding literary creativity. I think several existing research has already been focusing on some of her writing. One of that is called 洋人看京戏及其他, so foreigners looking at Peking opera or watching Peking opera and others. And this essay has been translated by herself from Chinese into English. And then by comparing and contrasting these two versions, we can see that she has a very clear idea of the target readers. And so she picked and chose the parts to be truncated from the original and then present some visions for the foreigners. So for trans-writing wise, she has been really clear and aware of the different target audience and their expectation, their cultural experience. And this is something that is quite new, which is not seen in existing studies about the first half of her literary career. But there's also something that is quite interesting and brought up by many scholars already, that the limitation also exists in English writing. While we think that it's freeing her from the literary realism of Chinese writing and the Mayforce tradition, there's also this other side of the coin where English and the Anglophone world, Anglophone book market is also trying to impose something that is also related to identity politics, which she also discussed in the piece that I think all three of us have mentioned, the Untitled speech at the Radcliffe Institute, where she's talking about how the Americanization has been a major tendency observed in all the Hong Kong, also Taiwan, and also America for sure, the Chinese American communities. So while it is opening possibilities for her to write in English, there's also a lot of limitations. There are also discussions about Eileen Chang's English translation and English writing ability, because we all know that she's a really good writer in English, and she's been well trained in the English department at Hong Kong University, and she also forced herself to write completely in English for the entire period when she was staying in Hong Kong. And then when we are comparing, for example, her translation and the later translations done by Karen Kingsbury and also Andrew Jones, you can see that she is she's well versed in English, but tends to write in the English that is not quite idiomatic and has a lot of her own linguistic characteristics, which causes some problem for the Anglophone readers to accept, to be able to enjoy her reading without having those linguistic barriers. So this is what I want to basically address in this part. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jenny, would you like to respond?
Oops, yes, sure. Thank you very much for the question. So the clip that I was showing, actually there was a glitch in my presentation, so there is sound of these credits. So I'll actually take the opportunity to go in and play it again now, and I can talk over it, that we can actually hear it as it's supposed to be played. Okay, so let me see, I'll share my screen. And then let me, oh shoot. a sec. So there's sound over this particular opening credits sequence. There's a song. It's much more triumphant. So this is what you all should have heard. And what you're seeing here, turn it down a little bit, but what you're seeing here is the opening credits of the film. So it's the names of the various actors and production team, etc., being superimposed in the Chinese characters over this montage sequence. So this was Yuan Muzhe's Street Angel film from 1937. There was an earlier film also directed by Yuan Muzhe, that is Du Shi Feng Guang, Cityscapes, that also utilizes this montage, but not in the opening credits. And I believe that film is less directly leftist in its content and storyline. So it's interesting to see it, perhaps in how it navigates from context, from this very celebratory kind of consideration of modern Shanghai to, in this case, a very critical consideration of the city, and by juxtaposing these particular images, and then in particular having all of the highlights and the markers of cosmopolitan modernity, foreign influence and presence, as you can see here, that then quickly slide into, as I mentioned, at the end, there's this Art Deco skyscraper that's filmed from top to bottom and then goes down into the slums of Shanghai where Street Angel is set. So, I mean, just kind of related metaphorically to thinking about Eileen Chang's practice and writing, I think it's important to consider the way in which she is able to also give us a depiction of Shanghai that is at once glamorous, enticing, alluring, lust-inducing, but then simultaneously has this danger that's constantly present and lurking beyond. And in the case of Lust Caution, you know, we have this really tragic demise of the lead protagonist. So that's what I'll say about that.
Thank you. Ryan, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah. First, thanks so much, Geraldine, for your comments and your questions, and for reminding us of the kind of thinking about her writing as Liu Yan and writing on water. And I think that's a nice metaphor for thinking about an Interasian or a transoceanic, transpacific reading of her work. So thank you so much. Great questions. First, the question about the irony in the depiction of Huaqiao characters. I think this irony is very deliberate, and it's actually part of how I read a 层次的对照, or subtle contrast in the cadence strategy being worked here, in that it's the awareness of the garishness of the stark contrast actually allows us to see subtlety, right, in the characters. And I think, you know, Yunwen had brought up a quote in the essay where Eileen Chang talked about the, you know, kind of her resistance to a self-orientalizing method of writing. And I think that kind of hints at the awareness of how she's constructing characters like Red Rose or Rose, right? The biracial character. And what I found, so it's an awareness of a kind of stereotype or a cliche, and then a repurposing of it for a kind of ironic effect. And not only that, in some sense, I get a sense in Red Rose, White Rose, that the character Red Rose herself knows that she's performing a role, right? Performing a certain type of otherness, even though she resents being called Tamen Huaqiao, right? Or they overseas Chinese, that she's performing a role for kind of enticement or seduction that is associated, that the kind of pure Chinese character who's being kind of constructed as such associates with Nanyang or with Southeast Asia. And in this way, it throws in a kind of Nanyang Orientalism that is also breaking up this duality of East and West that she's also kind of perhaps writing against, or we see at least in the quote that Yunwen gave us. And then in terms of explaining 层次的对照, I don't know if I can, in the sense that I don't know if I fully understand it in all its depth. I see it as and I think, Leo Lee and Ray Chow and others have really elaborated better than I can, but I certainly see it as a sensitivity and a sensibility of a kind of nuance that some Sinophone writers have definitely picked up on, and to kind of correlate it to my talk, I think back to Huang Jinshu, the Sinophone Malaysian writer, and Kim Chu's writings on what people might identify as infinitesimal differences between Hua and Zhong, Huawen and Zhongwen, right? But that he kind of hones in, his interest is in this infinitesimal, I can't even pronounce that word, difference, and elaborating it and theorizing it. And in a way, that was a foundational formulation from which Sinophone studies was cultivated. So Sinophone studies, in a way, can be figured as a field of Duizhao scholarship, right? In that regard. I did see, if you don't mind, there was a question from Karen Kingsbury.
I'm going to read it. So
okay,
that,
great. Go ahead.
That both you and Yunwen can both think about it and respond to it. So Professor Karen Kingsbury, who is one of the most important translators of Eileen Chang, brought us this question. So for Yunwen, but also for Brian, Professor Kingsbury writes, do you have any particular comments regarding "D" and "we" that Eileen Chang sees written in chalk on the bus stop bench in 1988? I find it interesting that she assumes these are Chinese names, whether Hokkien or other. She doesn't in the essay consider the possibility that these are African-American names, for instance. And from there, we can glimpse some of the lenses and filters through which this essay views sites and scenes in LA. She also wants us to know that a translation of this essay, 1988, will appear in a collection that Jie Zhang and Professor Kingsbury are now preparing, which will be published by New York Review Books very soon. So if maybe Yunwen and Brian could both respond to this question, that would be wonderful.
Brian, would you like to go first?
Well, I'll just say that I think it's thank you so much for the question. And it got me thinking that I did say in my book, it's less relevant here for the purposes of thinking about how Zhang is constructing these characters, whether we and they are actually of Chinese descent. But your questions got me thinking, actually it is relevant, right? It is relevant to how she's processing and filtering her sense of this community, right? And they very well might not be of Chinese descent. It might be a mistaken, a misrecognition. And what I love sometimes about misrecognitions is how productive they can be literarily, right? And so obviously they're productive here for a source of imagination for Eileen Chang, but it very well could be the linguistic milieu that she associates that romanization with could be a miscalibration, very well could be that. So if I'm moving forward with this piece, I would think about the ramifications of that form of filter for creating a narrative.
Thank you. So my observation is related to the text itself, because I don't know if you have recognized there are actually 2 pages. Starting from where she talked about we and D, there are 2 versions going down and none of them were finished. So what got me thinking was maybe this is not a realistic depiction of what she actually saw, but more like a fictional construction of what she's going to be talking about, especially related to the identity politics. This is also something that she started or initiated with a very realist literary realism, and then goes off to more imaginative touch. So this is what I think about this piece, and I really look forward to the English translation of this one, which will really be helpful for my book. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuman. And then there's one more question for Professor Lynn from Jane Cole, and the question is, considering your interdisciplinary approach to art historical studies and success incorporating a variety of different forms of visual culture into your work on Shanghai, will Zhang Eileen and her archive at USC be a part of your newest project on video art in America? So Jenny, if you could respond to that.
Hi, Janie, Cole, nice to see you. Thank you for the question. Yes, it will, in fact, and I'm giving a talk at the Center for Advanced Studies in Visual Art at the National Gallery that's coming up early next month, and I will be talking about the cross-cultural legacy of Zhang Eileen, and in particular her writings on the Qipao, and how those get kind of reimagined and refashioned in contemporary artist Charlene Liu's installation works and silkscreen prints, and thinking about issues of translation, adaptation. Yeah, so very much will be a present in my next project. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. I wonder whether we're already out of time, or if we have maybe...
I think we are. I realize, because we also should have a little bit of a break before we launch into our super exciting next program with Professor Ray Chow. But yeah, I want to thank you, Geraldine, for that amazing response and such a generous questions that you provided for us. So thank you.
Wonderful talks, and for really moving forward the scholarship and the insight and the analysis of Zhang Eileen's text, and to make it so available to many more readers all over the world. And this will truly impact also, I think, the development of writing in Chinese, as well as writers in other languages who may also be very profoundly inspired and influenced by Eileen Chang. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this third and final segment of today's program. We are so excited to be unveiling the virtual exhibition that the student curators have been hard at work on all semester long, and they have done a fabulous job of bringing a new life into the materials that are located in USC's libraries in our special collections. So I'm going to share my screen and just say a few words about the curators themselves, and then I'll let them take it away and introduce their exhibition to you. All right. Hopefully everybody, everyone can see this screen. Yes. Okay, wonderful. So this is the landing page of the exhibition that is designed by Sophia here, and she will talk about today. I also wanted to just pull up all the names of the curators who have joined us. We're going to be talking for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of time to take your questions, hopefully from those attendees about the project. So Tong Li and I helped to organize this project, and the exhibition is very much driven by the student curators, including the chief curators who were in charge of helping their teammates to compile these wonderful pages. Yiwei Lu, who is joining us today, a master's candidate in visual anthropology. Lillian Ning, who is a PhD candidate, PhD candidate to be in East Asian languages and cultures. Sui Wang, who could not join us today, but she is an MA student in East Asian Studies. And Ming Yin, who also could not join us today, but she is a MA student in curatorial practices and the public sphere. As well as our undergraduate representative, Alexandra Zarki, here joining us today from non-governmental organizations and social change and public relations major. Sophia, as I mentioned, headed up the design team, and she will be talking today. We also have shout outs to the amazing Anya Chung, who helped name the exhibition in a bronze mirror, Jason Cruz, who works tirelessly on the design, Li Jin Fan, Jenny Fang, Sky Guo, Layla Hassel, Jenny Huang, Apple Jean, Linda Lee, Jessica Lynn, who will present today on the second page on Chinese life and fashions, Helena Liu, Jack Odom, Ray Chen Tsai, Stella Wang, Zai Wing Wang, also goes by Sally, Mignon Nai Man Shu, and Songyue Zhang. So thank you so much for all your hard work. We also want to just extend our utmost thanks to Curtis Fletcher and Remy Wedden, who helped make this possible through their expertise in Scalar platform. And we also want to thank especially Li Ping Chen, who just joined us, a postdoctoral scholar at USC's East Asian Studies Center, who helped fact check and look through the correspondences. Susie Norshat, librarian with a specialty in Los Angeles collections. Rebecca Hall, the curator at USC Pacific Asia Museum, and Garfield Lam, who is the reference archivist at the University Archives of the University of Hong Kong, who so generously lent their materials and allowed us to show them in this exhibition. We also want to say a special shout out to Professor Dominic Chung, who we believe is joining us now, and who Yiwei Liu will talk about now in her introduction to the exhibition. Okay, so Yiwei, why don't you take it away? Thank you.
Sure, thank you for the introduction. Hi everyone, my name is Yiwei Liu, and I created this page with my team members Jenny Huang and Helena Liu. We decided to focus our research on Eileen Chang's life in Los Angeles because we're all fascinated by Chang's legendary life, and we're also passionate about the city of Los Angeles. Being one of the most influential Chinese writers of the 20th century, Chang spent almost 25 years in Los Angeles until she passed away in 1995. Besides Los Angeles, Chang is also closely associated with two other cities, Shanghai, where she was born, and Hong Kong, where she went to university. Chang was born into a noble family, but unfortunately, her mother wasn't present when she was growing up, and her father and stepmother were not kind to her at all. Writing was her way of escaping from reality. Chang attended St. Mary's Hall, an American school in Shanghai, and demonstrated talent at a young age. Her first novel was published in her school newspaper when she was 12. In 1939, she studied at the University of Hong Kong, but World War II interrupted her education and she had to move back to Shanghai. From 1943 to 1952, Chang was very productive and published many famous stories, such as The First Incense Burner, 第一炉香, and Love in a Fallen City, 倾城之恋. She also married her first husband, Hu Lancheng, who was a Japanese sympathizer. Their short-lived marriage tarnished her reputation, and she felt vulnerable living in mainland China after the Communist Party took over in 1949. She moved to Hong Kong for 3 years and then to the United States in 1955. During her second year in the United States, she married an American writer, Ferdinand Rayer. Despite Chang's fame in China, her literature wasn't very popular in the United States. The couple suffered from financial problems until 1967, when her husband passed away. Chang continued to write novels and screenplays, translated the 1894 Qing novel, The Sing-Song Girls of Shanghai, 海上花列传, and took up positions at various American universities. Chang moved to Los Angeles in 1972. There, she lived a reclusive lifestyle and frequently moved. My co-curators and I were able to find some of the addresses where Chang lived through many correspondences with Chinese literacy critique and Columbia University professor C.T. Xia. These letters are presented as related artifacts on this page and are very valuable for researchers today to learn about her life in LA. We also made a map based on the addresses from her letters and postcards. As you can see here, Chang lived in many neighborhoods in LA, including Mid-Wilshire and Hollywood. In 1995, she passed away in her apartment in Westwood. As per her last will and testament, her landlord, Stone Ling, together with others, scattered Chang's ashes into the Pacific Ocean. Professor Dominic Chang, Zhang Tuo 教授, who I believe is here today as an audience, taught Chinese and comparative literature at USC then. He was asked by Stone Ling to assist in carrying out the sea burial, dealing with the press, and shipping her belongings, bequeathed to friends Stephen and Mason to Hong Kong. If you click this link here, you will see the video of Professor Chung talking about this experience. Recognizing the significance of Eileen Chang's literary legacy, Professor Chung collaborated with the Songs, who donated a rich repository of Chang's articles, essays, speeches, correspondences, manuscripts, and photographs to USC, establishing the special collection of Zhang Eileen Chang papers in USC's library that we are highlighting today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iwei. Can we have Sophia please come on next and talk a little bit about the design?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. So the design team had 3 main focuses: to choose background images, create the color scheme, and to create the landing page of the virtual exhibition. With all of these tasks, our primary job was to ensure that the visual elements reflected Eileen Chang's work and contextualized it through stylistic elements. So each of the different backgrounds you see is actually a close-up of an image we found in the archives. Most of them are blown up portions of interesting patterns on the clothing featured in the images. When creating the landing page, the group came to a consensus that we wanted it to feel as if you were physically sifting through these archives, ergo the collage-like design. The homepage also gives us a sneak peek into the virtual exhibition contains. All 7 sections are featured via an image that relates to their content. So that said, we believe that choosing colors based on what we could find in the archives was the best way forward. We looked at the content of the exhibition as well as the bulk of the archives themselves. After some sifting through, we ended up with 2 very distinct color palettes, one derived from a description of a dress she was wearing in a photo, and one inspired by her article titled Chinese Life and Fashions for the 20th Century in 1943. To provide some insight into our thought process, here's a quote from that article and how we used it to inform the color scheme of the exhibition. So according to Chang, an ensemble for a woman worn throughout the Qin Dynasty featured a tightly fitting small jacket, worn in bed and usually of some enticing shade, peach or liquid red. We noted that she draws a connection between intimacy, even sensuality, and these colors, as she details when and how they're worn in Chinese society. Informed by this quote and the general knowledge that a lot of her literature features themes of romance and love, we felt compelled to use red for the exhibition. We actually ended up choosing a palette consisting of red, gold, and black. Visually and conceptually, these colors seemed to be a more appropriate way to display Chang's work. And yeah, thank you, and I hope you're enjoying the visual elements of the exhibition.
Thank you so much, Sophia. So next we have Jessica, who's going to introduce the second page on Chinese life and fashions that Sophia was just quoting.
So, hi, I'm Jessica Ling. I'm a USC undergraduate with my major in design, and I edited the page with Sui Wang. We did our research focusing on Eileen Chang's essay, Chinese Life and Fashions. She wrote it for the 20th century in 1943. The article, as observed by scholar Rachel, our keynote speaker of the day in Women and Chinese Modernity, the Politics of Reading Between West and East, offers not only a chronicle cycle of modern Chinese fashion, but as sophisticated theorization of Chinese modernity and modern consciousness linked to the vanishing of superfluous detail. As Chang wrote in her essay, in 1920s China, women began wearing long gowns similar to the Chinese dynasty Changpao Changshan or Changpao Changshan worn by men, signaling a rise awareness of gender equality. Then Chang further describes the evolution of Cheongsam dress, qipao or qipao, and discusses the socio-cultural significance of it. Here we have 4 related artifacts of Cheongsam dress from the 1940s. They are all sponsored by the USC Pacific Asia Museum. The vanishing of detail is represented here as the non-functional ornamentation on women's clothing is almost disappeared. These repetitive patterns on qipao become not that sophisticated compared to the ones before the Qing Dynasty. They also accentuate Chinese women's femininity and sexuality as they become more tightly packed and more tailored to the body curve of women with Western dimensional cuts. The length of the clothing was also shortened. Most well known for her writings, Chang was also a gifted illustrator. She made 12 illustrations about Chinese women's clothing and hairstyles from different periods for Chinese life and fashions to supplement her words. Together with her friend Yan Ying, Chung also designed the front cover of a book, Romance 传奇 and Riding on Water 流言. As she was deeply devoted to fashion, Chung was often pictured wearing qipao, like those that adorn her female protagonists. Here on the left side, and we can see Chang's photo from the USC Digital Library of her wearing a Chinese-style dress. Also, the library collection has a few related personal photographs of Chang. These photographs reveal her careful attention to clothing and accessories, and the accompanying descriptions help to provide us a glimpse into her cross-cultural musings.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Lillian will join us now for a discussion of the next 3 pages that she supervised.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jessica. Hi, my name is Lillian An, and I'm a PhD student in East Asian Languages and Cultures at USC. First of all, I would like to thank Jenny and Tom for putting this exhibition together. Eileen Chang is one of my favorite writers, and she inspired my reading interest in modern Chinese literature. So it's truly my honor to be one of the curators of this project and introduce the pages to you. With Sally Wang, Leila Hazel, and Apple Jean, we co-created the page Love in Fallen Cities. This is because when we talk about Eileen Chang, we cannot not talk about cities. Her literary fame began in Shanghai with her publications of a number of short stories. However, behind the stories that she claimed to have written for Shanghainese people, many of the inspirations came from Hong Kong. Chang was accepted to the University of London on full scholarship, but due to the outbreak of World War II, she instead studied English literature at the University of Hong Kong between 1939 and 1941. Thanks to the University Archives of the University of Hong Kong, we are fortunate to be able to feature her student records at that time, in which we can see that Chang was a stellar student. The journey to Hong Kong was significant because Chang met her lifelong friend Yan Ying, who shared many memorable times with Chang in Hong Kong and Shanghai, and later helped design the book cover of Chang's romances, 传奇. Following her sojourn in Hong Kong, Chang wrote many literary works set in the colonial city along her birthplace, Shanghai, such as Love in a Fallen City, 倾城之恋. In 1984, Hong Kong director Xu Anhua made a film based on the same title of Love in a Fallen City. We don't know whether Chang herself had watched the movie, but C.T. Xia remarked that he did not like the adaptation in his holiday card to Chang. Another film adaptation that we have discussed earlier, Only's Lust Caution, 色戒, was generally considered a great success. Based on Chang's novella set in Hong Kong and Shanghai, Lust Caution stands in the words of scholar Ray Chow as a story of a track turned against itself. Having rewritten the story several times, Chang finally completed it in the 1970s after immigrating to the US. She asked Stephen Song to mail the manuscript of Lust Caution on her behalf. Both Love in a Fallen City and Lust Caution reflect Chang's personal experience living through colonialism, war, and heartbreak in Hong Kong and Shanghai. Moving next, with Yue Chen Chai, Song Yue Zhang, and Le Jinfang, we co-created a page titled Red Roses, White Roses. Chang literature revolves around women, gender, and sexuality. Red Rose and White Rose, 红玫瑰与白玫瑰, depicts gender stereotypes in Republican China. Focusing on 2 female protagonists, one bound to Chinese tradition and the other modern and independent, it explores how gender stereotypes are constructed by men in traditional Chinese society, while simultaneously revealing a multi-layered feminist perspective. 18 Springs, 18春, similarly features 2 sisters and illustrates ill-fated romance and restrained love in the midst of unfavorable social circumstances. Rouge of the North, 越女, as extended version of Chang's acclaimed work, The Golden King, 金锁记, depicts a young woman's twisted transformation following her marriage to the blind and the bedridden son of a rich family. The 3 literary works and correspondences featured on this page reflect Chang's critique of the institution of marriage and her yearning for true love. Red Rose and White Rose, 18 Springs, and The Rouge of the North were all edited into films. Since Chang often paired 2 female characters in the same story to narrate women's dilemmas in society, we also exhibit here photographs of pairs of women in the 1940s China, such as Eileen Chang and Li Xianlan, the controversial figure in Manchukuo, as well as Chang and her aunt. The next page that I co-curated with Linda Lee is titled Immortal and Marriage. While it is well known that Chang had a precarious relationship with her mother, as reflected in Literary Union, Xiao Tuanyuan, it is less known that Chang also wrote numerous screenplays about ambivalent mother-daughter relationships. This page features photographs of Chang's mother from both the University Archives of the University of Hong Kong and USC's Library Eileen Chang papers. Eileen Chang's mother came from a renowned aristocratic family, and she received a relatively westernized education. She was unable to put up with Chang's father's opium smoking and concubines. When Eileen Chang was a little girl, her mother decided to go to Europe for personal liberation. Her absence left a void in Chang's childhood. The relationship between Chang and her father further deteriorated after her father took a second wife. Chang would come to express the complicated relationships between mothers, stepmothers, and daughters in her writings, such as Father Takes a Bride, Xiao Er The screenplay provides a happy ending that departs from Chang's own unsatisfying family life. While Father Takes a Bride portrays the stepmother in a positive light, Chang continued to express skepticism about marriage. Her screenplay, Long Live the Missus, 太太万岁, both a melodrama and screwball comedy, depicts a modern woman in marital crisis. The female protagonist constantly tells white lies to help everyone in the family, but her overtly pleasing gestures turn counterproductive and lead to satirical events that harmed her marriage. Here, Chang questions familial happiness and the meaning of marriage. In addition to photographs of Chang's mother, this page exhibits C.T. Hsia's correspondences with Chang regarding Long Live the Missus. And I'll pass to Alex for introducing the next page. Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian, and thank you, Alex. And thank you, Ming Yin, who curated this final page, and Alex will talk about and present in addition to the pop-up page that she organized. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Alex. It was such an honor to be part of this team, and I just want to thank Jenny and Tong for including me. I learned so much. So basically, the final page in our exhibition was curated by our co-curators and my curatorial group with the pop-up, and it basically focuses on Eileen Chang's cross-cultural studies and her continued legacy. Chang spent much of her time in the United States researching and translating the classic Qing Dynasty novels Dream of the Red Chamber and The Sing-Song Girls of Shanghai. This page features Chang's English translation of Sing-Song Girls with her handwritten notes, a speech delivered at Radcliffe regarding the importance of translation, correspondences that discuss Chang's work on Dream of the Red Chamber and Sing-Song Girls of Shanghai, and photographs of Chang's grandmother with her children, including Chang's mother, wearing Qing Dynasty era apparel. From Chang's perspective, Dream of the Red Chamber, written in the 1750s, stands as the first novel about romantic love in China, and Sing-Song Girls came as its late Qing successor. Published in its entirety in 1894, Han Bangqin's Sing-Song Girls focuses on courtesan life in the late Qing dynasty and uniquely portrays romantic love between courtesans and their clients. Eileen Chang's unwavering commitment to translating and sharing these stories with English readers, together with her transformative foregrounding of female protagonists and nuanced tales of love and familial dynamics, echo today. Supported by Chang's legacy, contemporary Chinese American women writers, artists, and designers continue to create evocative works that probe, embody, and celebrate cross-cultural identities and experiences. Finally, our exhibition proudly features notable Chinese American women artists and designers in our very own Roski School of Art and Design. The first artist who we will be featuring is Patty Chang. Patty Chang is a Chinese American artist who specializes in performance, video, and installation art. Like Eileen Chang, Patty Chang creates art that contradicts the stereotypes of Chinese American women as passive. Chang is anything but passive. Chang's 2001 video artwork, In Love, which was created in 2001, delves into the intimate relations and familial dynamics that Chang wrote about so extensively during her lifetime. Alice Feng is another Roski affiliated artist who we are featuring. She is a Chinese American architect and designer who is deeply passionate about prioritizing the human experience in all of her work. She founded Feng and Blatt Architects, a group that designs flexible spaces and structures, such as her piece titled Colony, that are conducive to learning, living, and creation. Lastly, the last artist who we are featuring in this pop-up page is Lynn Kirk, who is our Dean of USC Roski's School of Art and Design. And she is a Chinese American designer and artist. She aims to depict design as a cross-cultural language, which furthers Eileen Chang's legacy. And that is epitomized in her 2006 painting that we featured titled Edge. We hope that you enjoyed this tour in the Bronze Mirror, Eileen Chang's life and literature. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Alex, and everyone. So if all the curators could turn your cameras back on, and we can see if there are any questions coming in through the chat, that would be fantastic. So I'll take us back to the home page and let's take a look. Do we have any questions? Let's see. Are there any questions for the curators now? I don't think I'm seeing any coming in from the Q&A, but if anybody would like to send them in, please feel free. Otherwise, we can, oh, do I see one? How long did it take to put all of this exhibition together? From Melinda Gandara. Would anyone like to talk about that? I think so Tong had the idea for this exhibition and for the conference, and she came to me last spring semester, or maybe it was early winter, when we could still meet on campus and have a coffee and chat, winter or even the fall. And it sounded like such a great, fantastic idea to me. And I thought, well, I have all these brilliant students that I know are going to be excited to work on it, and various experts on Zhang Ling across campus. So sure, this sounds like a great idea, and it's going to be very fun and very easy. So it was not very easy, I would say, but that's not because the students weren't brilliant. They absolutely were so hardworking, so invested. And also without Tong's help, this really couldn't have come together. So it was a real team effort. If we had to put in and I remember then when I first met with all the students and I was telling them how much time they'd have to work on it. And this was in the very beginning of the semester. I think we'd start the first week of fall classes. And I think I said about 5 hours per week. So I don't know if that stuck true, but it was certainly a very collective effort. So I don't know how many hours altogether, but many over, I guess, when it started as a dream in Tong Li's mind, and then grew into what it was through all the hard work and persevering spirit of all of our student curators and everyone that helped us in the Amundsen lab. Yeah. Would you want to add maybe something, Lillian, Alex, Sophia, Jessica, or Iwei, just about perhaps how, because I know a lot of you sort of changed as you started going into this project, what you imagined it would look like, and what the final result was. And maybe if you could tell us something that was exciting or surprising or challenging that you found along the way as you were digging into the archive and looking through the materials. That would be great to hear. I
can speak a little bit about the process of curating, because I think was definitely one of the hardest projects I have ever done, because everything's online. I mean, if it wasn't for COVID, this exhibition would be presented in the library. But because we were not able to see the artifacts in person, it was really difficult for even for us, because a lot of the letters and correspondences, I really had to zoom in really big and then see it little by little. Plus, we're working with people who are overseas. We're all in different areas. I remember in my team, LA team, we had people from Hong Kong, from Philippines, and from Shanghai. So it was just really hard for us to come up with a time that we can all meet together, but we all conquered this challenge. I'm so proud of us.
I have a little bit to add to kind of what Yue was saying. One thing that was really interesting for me was my process wasn't so much digging into the archives, but more looking at contemporary art by Chinese American women to kind of contextualize Eileen Chang's experience. And something that was really cool was, as my project kind of evolved, I was looking at such a wide range of artists doing so many different things, and I narrowed it down to kind of specifically female artists who are affiliated with Roski. And that was just really incredible, because I got to learn about all of these amazing Chinese American female voices that exist on my campus. And it just was so inspiring to kind of get to delve into that and to learn about their work. And now I'm just so excited to go back to campus and know that I'm in the presence of that type of art and revolutionary work and cross-cultural language that I really got to kind of study in this exhibition. So that was really cool for me.
Thank you. Well, that sounds like a wonderful, hopeful note to end on, as to looking ahead towards the future. And Tong and I do hope to have a kind of part 2 of this celebration of Eileen Chang. We have some plans in the works, including the utilization of the real exhibition space, the treasure room in the Doheny Library, potential screening with Ong Lee of Lust Caution. We'll try to see if we can get Ray Chow back onto campus in person. Lots of things to think about for 2021 to 2022. And so thank you so much to everyone for joining us here today. And I hope that we all continue to follow Professor Ray Chow's guidance to us to read more Eileen Chang and to read her with more love in the future. So thank you, everyone. And please stay in touch, and hope we can meet again soon, next year, next spring.
Jenny, I think there's another question in the Q&A. Melody asked, how can the public view the exhibition online?
Oh, great question. Yes, thank you. Follow up. Tong, will this be published on the USC Library's webpage?
And yes, it will be available online. It's actually already live online, so we will have a link to the USC Library page later.
Great. So stay tuned for the link coming your way, and please take your time looking at the exhibition. And we also invite those of you from the public, those scholars, people that are working on Eileen Chang and continuing to study her, to take full advantage of the amazing collections that we have here at USC. Thanks to Professor Dominic Chung, who I see has just appeared. If you'd like to add any final parting words of wisdom, Professor Chung, we would love to hear from you if you're available or able. Otherwise, we will just be happy knowing that you have been a part of this. Here he is. Hello, Professor Chung.
I guess we haven't met, but I'm sure that we will meet one way or the other in the future. I'm very impressed with the presentation of the exhibition, especially first of all with the title called in a bronze mirror. I don't know whether that was done deliberately, because I'm a collector of the bronze mirror. But let me give you a history of the bronze mirror in the Tang Dynasty. It was recorded by the first emperor of Tang, Taizong, to talk about the bronze mirror when his minister Wei Zhang died. He said that using the bronze as a mirror, one can beautify his appearance. Using past as a mirror, one can discern the rise and fall of the dynasties. And finally, using people as a bronze mirror, one can apprehend the vice and virtues of himself. So in other words, that when Wei Zhang died, the emperor mourned and said that he has lost a mirror. And you can see the symbolism of the bronze mirror when it is applied to the many meaning of life, especially, I think in this occasion, we are talking about using Eileen Chang as a mirror, as a bronze mirror to reflect the many sides of life. So it also reminds me of Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, the sequel to the Alice in Wonderland, which is called Through the Looking Glass, that Alice at this time walked into the mirror instead of going down to the cave. The presentation itself, I've been watching the presentation, actually, the conference from this morning. And I would very much like to say something about when Geraldine was talking about, and Brian, these are my colleagues in the East Asian department. When they talk about the translation of Eileen Zhang's Liu Yan, written on water, actually, what came out from Eileen Chang was in fact a quote from John Keats, the English poet. He wrote an epitaph for himself and said, "Here lies the one whose name was written in water, or was writ in water." So that becomes a very famous epitaph, just as famous as Shakespeare's epitaph in the Tombstone. And that was why Eileen Zhang was using that as a quote for Liu Yan, or the rumors or gossips, as Professor Zhao mentioned it. The exhibition itself presents a full legacy of Eileen Zhang's life. And especially with the collection, but I'm sure that many of you have seen my lecture on Eileen Chang last time in the Doheny Library to talk about how it was created and so on and so forth. But I would like to go into the second part of it on the Chinese life and fashions. You are a specialist on the fashions of costumes and qipao and Eileen Zhang. And you must know that these essays, or the essay on Chinese people and fashions, was written in 1943 in Shanghai for a German magazine called the 20th Century with a 2X. Chief editor was the German Klaus Mernert. And Eileen Zhang, especially when it was connected to costumes and film, that also reminds me of the film review he wrote for the journal in a special column called On the Screen. She actually, while she was writing about the life and Chinese life and fashions, she has drawn, I think, 10 illustrations of the costumes. But on the screen, she mentioned about 12 movies that was shown in Shanghai and China. Now, that has something to do with the historical background, because this is the way of moving on to Zhang Eileen and film. Not just lust and caution, but also her interest in film, especially as a script writer, for a film writer for later on in Hong Kong. And especially when that appeared on the screen, particularly with the Chinese film, because as you know, this German edition, this German editor journal was related to the Axis countries against the Allies. So then you can tell in 1943, before Japanese surrendered in 1945, the Eileen Chang was still caught in between these two sides, you see, especially her relationship with Hu Lancheng. Because the Axis consists of Japan, Germany, and Italy. So especially with Japan. And that also was related to the exhibition that mentioned about the 18th Spring. The 18th Spring was later rewritten as the Ban Sheng Yuan. Why was it rewritten? Because Ban Sheng Yuan was talking, the 18th Spring, Zhang Eileen did not use her real name Zhang Eileen. She used a man's name, just like many of them in the 19th century Victorian novel, that Jane Austen, or not Jane Austen, but women writers were using man's name. So Zhang Eileen was using the pseudonym of Liang Jing, which is a man's name, in the propagation of the 18th Spring. So you can also tell how his political shifting from the 18th Spring to the Ban Sheng Yuan later on. Now, in regard to the Love in the Foreign City, I disagree with Professor Siti Shah by saying that it was not a very good movie. I think it is a great movie that represents Zhang Eiling's connection with Professor Bernard's way of talking about Huaqiao, especially Fan Liuyuan, if I may recall correctly, was from Malaysia and then coming over. And there was, that goes into Brian's specialty on the Sinophones, and particularly with the Ma Hua Zhuojia, the Malay Chinese writers and the Malaysian background. So in other words, that I mentioned actually in my last lecture about the Love in the Foreign City, that creates a film that represents represents the relationship between Shanghai and Hong Kong. I remember a couple of years ago that that the film has become an epitome of the early days of Hong Kong, especially the Repulse Bay. You must know about it. That was represented many years ago when I and Professor Roberto Dias from the Spanish and Italian Portuguese department, we brought a couple of 20 students to Hong Kong and Macau for the overseas course, and that we have studied Love in a Foreign City as a film, as a novel, and as a location to visit the Repulse Bay Hotel and to have high tea there and so on and so forth. So in other words, that, and Xu Anhua still now is making a film on Di Yi Lu Xiang, the first incenser, and so on and so forth. And that also represents the location, not just as a film itself, but as Hong Kong or Shanghai. And in regard to the motherhood and marriages, now Zhang Eiling's mother, Wang Yifan, has become more and more important because of the publication that was published after Zhang Eiling's death. That Zhang Eiling's manuscript was republished was published after her death in regards to the following titles: the Lei Feng Ta, the Thunderpeak Pagoda, the Yi Jing, the Book of Change, and the one earlier was Xiao Tuan Yuan, the Little Reunion. And these are the books that we all have to read in order to trace the childhood of Eileen Chang in the Thunderpeak Pagoda together with her brother, and then also the life of her mother, Wang Yifan, in the Book of Change. But I'm afraid that not too many people are really talking about this in talking about Zhang Eileen's life legacy. And these are the ones that would have to read, especially the recent scholarship in Taiwan now has already moved to talk about Hu Nanceng more than Zhang Eileen, to use Hu Nanceng as a reflection of Eileen Zhang's life. And that, not Raya or anybody, but Hu Nanceng. And that also goes into how much she was attached to him and then has to walk away from him and so on and so forth. And so these are the ones, and I would suggest that Yuan or many of the scholars who read through in Chinese to go into the reading of a recent books published in 2020, a professor from Taida, Taiwan University, Zhang Xiaohong, who wrote 2 books just published about last month or 2 months ago on the wigs of Zhang Eileen the Jiafa, that many of you must know about, and also textualizing Zhang Eileen, Wenben Zhang Eileen. And these are the 2 books that would talk about the fetish type of attachment Zhang Eileen was attached to all the costumes and the wigs that they later was using. These are most probably all the things that I wish to say. As I said, I've been only committed to comment only 3 days ago, and I haven't been really prepared myself to go into all these talks. And then if I have a chance to talk more, perhaps a few more occasions, we can meet in campus or in Doheny, we can still go into it. Thank you very much.
Amazing. I think we would all love that so much. And already what you were able to say and prepare in such a short time was such a rich treasure trove of information. Thank you so much. And opened up so much. And the bronze mirror history that you told us, I think is actually, that's the perfect way to end. Because we think not only about looking towards the future, but about how the study of history and of the past can help our understanding. Of
I think so.
So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And we will, yes, definitely see each other, hopefully on campus soon for a coffee.
Sure, we'll do that. Sure.